Welcome to Tekpub Concepts Part 1. This is a free series from Tekpub, and today we're going to be talking about dependency injection and inversion of control, and we're going to be using Nate Kohari's Ninject. So let's get right to it. And the first thing I want to address is something, if you're not familiar with these concepts, you're probably going to be feeling when you first see the code. And I pretty much can't put it any other way than you got to be kidding me. I know it's a feeling that I had when I first saw it, and I thought, how complicated can people possibly make something? It's one of those things that until you actually use it and try it, you might not see the benefits. And I want to separate these issues straight up front. There is the understanding of the patterns and understanding of the use of them that you will probably get immediately. Dependency injection is a very easy pattern to understand. Interface-based programming is also something that's easy to understand. However, why you would want to use something like this is not. So what I hopefully will show you using Ninject here and a little application I'm about to create is the ability and how to use this in an application. The other thing that I've encountered is a lot of prevailing opinions that people have in the industry, such as inversion of controllers for super smart people. Maybe you've heard something like this before. It's for guys who really know what they're doing, craftsmen, these dudes who've been working in the industry for a really long time. The guys who made these tool sets are really complex, man. They have a lot of, tough, deep programming rules that you have to adhere to. The average Joe developer won't know or won't care. And, generally that community over there anyway, they look down their noses at the unwashed masses who don't get it. I don't know. I'd rather just stay away. So all of this line of thinking doesn't really address the core issues. What it does address is probably some underlying angst and associations that IOC and DI, if I can use their acronyms, have. And that is, well, point blank, alt.net. And the interactions of the alt.net community have not gone very well. Let's just put it that way. And so there's a lot of knee-jerk reactions on both sides, but it doesn't mean that you, as a developer, should keep yourself from learning the concept. I'm not going to tell you have to use the tool. That's not what I'm here for. I just want to show you this as a tool set that you can know about, discuss, and maybe someday, when you're thinking about it, you could say, hey, you know what, maybe that dependency injection could help me here. That is the goal of this screencast. But ultimately, it all resolves down to this. Try it. Try it. You just might like it. And I won't lie to you, some of the concepts are a bit difficult. I mean, I do think you're going to get it. I think you're going to understand the patterns, also how to set it up and use it. In terms of putting it together, though, in an application sense, sometimes that takes a little bit of doing, but it is not rocket science by any stretch. And moreover, you, sir or ma'am, are a very, very smart person. You're a computer programmer. You decided to come here and watch this screencast. You are ahead of the curve. Give yourself some credit. And if you feel like, well, this is another fad, I don't know if I should give myself over to it, could be. But you know what? We're on a long, strange trip together, you and me in this industry. And the truth of it is, there is a lot of fads that come and go. People could even say .NET is a fad. Everything is a fad in a long enough time scale. Whether or not you should learn it is a different story. Well, enough of that. Let's jump to some code, and I'll show you how to set up a couple of things. We're going to start with the pattern itself, dependency injection, and I'm going to be using Nate Kohari's example that he has up on Codeplex. And from there, we're going to use dependency injection to wire the thing up, and I'll show you a few tricks, and also suggest why you might care. So let's jump to it. I'm here at ninject.org, Nate Kohari's inversion of control container. It is open source, created by Nate a year or two ago, maybe more. And from here you can find documentation, the download, you can report bugs, community, all that good stuff. I should tell you that the source code is up at GitHub. If you head over to the Codeplex site, that's where you'll find the documentation. And the good thing is, if you just go to ninject.codeplex.com, here's where all the links are that you're going to need. The source repository was moved over to GitHub. However, Nate is using the wiki here on Codeplex to spin up his examples. So what I want to do today is I want to go through the user guide. And if I click on the user guide, it'll take me through some walkthroughs, and I'm going to use the exact code that he has in here. If I go through dependency injection by hand, you can see the stuff we're dealing with is the samurai. Here's my sample application, and to put this in context, let's pretend that I have a client who called me up one day and said, hey, can you make me a multi-user dungeon If you know what one of those is, by the way, you are older than me, and I feel sorry for you. They are the very first MMOs. They were console-based. They worked on text. You would send little things back and forth, like, oh no, you're being attacked by a troll. I smite them with my mighty hammer of doom. Anyway, so we're going to build one of those MUDs, and we're going to make it warrior slash shogun period based, and in it I need to have a thing called a samurai. That is my first requirement. Samurai and a sword. So let's do that, and I'm going to add a class, and I'll just call it samurai. And then I'm going to add another class, and I'm going to give him a weapon, and I'll call it sword. There we go. Okay, well, that's easy enough. The samurai swings a sword, so let's add some code to the samurai here and give him a weapon. Alright, now our samurai here is equipped with a sword, and he's got a single method called attack. And he attacks a target. You pass in a string, and he attacks that target. Hooray. And then we have a sword. And the sword has a single method called hit, and when the samurai attacks, he hits with the sword. It couldn't be any easier than that, so our MUD is well on its way. Now all I got to do is create my samurai, washed masses, to borrow a line. There we go. Okay, and so I can see the console. I'm going to tell it to read, and now when I run this, see if it works. Hooray! Chop the unwashed masses clean in half. That's exciting. Okay, well, our samurai is now wielding his weapon. Everything is working as it should. So we go and deliver the application. So we mail it off, and the client calls immediately and says, oh, you know what? I completely forgot. We also need a shuriken here because, well, the samurai carried more than one weapon. I want this to be realistic, so let's give him a shuriken. A shuriken is a small sword. So let's do that. Well, I think I simply just add another class here. This will work. And in here, I'll just kind of follow the same thing. I will put a hit method in here. And there, great. And then instead of this, we'll just say pierces the armor. There we go. All right, great. Shuriken. So we have that in there. The one thing we forgot to ask the client was, you know, how are we gonna know what the samurai is going to use? How can we tell it? Well, yeah, we can figure this out for ourselves. We're smart guys. So in here, we'll just add in a shuriken, and we'll keep it private. Great. And then when the constructor is called, we will instantiate this thing into a new shuriken. And finally, how are we going to decide what they're going to use to attack? Well, probably the easiest thing is to have some sort of Boolean switch. So I will just say use sword. And in here, I will pass this in as this. Use sword, spelled properly. Although, you know what? I don't think samurais could spell. Could they read and write? I don't really know. And there we go. Okay. So now what we can do is alter this, and we can say if, well, that should work. Now what we need to do is go back over here to our attack routine, or excuse me, to the main method, and then tell it to use the sword or not. So I want to see what it looks like when it uses the shuriken. And so in here, I just have to pop open IntelliSense so I understand that I pass in a Boolean, and I know what that Boolean is for. So I can say false. Oops, I take that out. All right, so now when you run this, we're going to pierce the armor. Yes, we do. We pierce armor. It's exciting. Okay, well, we're just about done. But then my boss comes in and he sits down to do a code review. And he looks over my code and he says, wow, you know, you've got some conditional logic in here. And how, you know, this is kind of wasted code. Haven't you ever used an interface before? And I said, well, sure, I just wasn't sure if I needed one. And he says, well, do you know if the client's going to want other weapons in the future? I mean, it is a samurai. And what do you think about the future? And I say, I mean, how much do I need to worry about the future right now? And the answer is a lot. You know, you want to keep this thing as flexible as possible. My boss just gives me that look. Uh-oh. All right. So what I can do to loosen this thing up, now what I probably should have done in the first place, because what I've incurred right here is technical debt, that's the term, is used an interface. Now, if you've never used an interface before, I'm about to show you why it's a good thing to do. Instead of using the actual implementation, you use a representation of it, which is called a interface. So over here, I can create one. I just simply right-click, hit refactor, and then extract interface. Now the interface I'm creating, I could use sword. It's both a shuriken and a sword. Well, they're a sword, but what's better is I should set this as just a plain old weapon, because you never know. There might be other weapons coming in the future. So I hit OK and I extract out that interface. Code file is created for me, and I'm off and running. All right, so let's head back over here and make sure that this thing is set to iWeapon. This is how you tell the compiler, hey, this class right here implements this interface. You can always use this. Great. So head over to the shuriken and do the same thing. It already implements a hit method, so it's implementing this interface, so we're good to go. So now both of these things are working. That's good. Let's compile this. It compiles. Let's make sure it runs. We should still be using the shuriken, and it does. All right, so that's good stuff. Well, now let's go back and implement the interface. Now, this is where people have a hard time because you can't instantiate an interface. So how in the world are you going to use it? Well, the good news is I can just come in here and I can get rid of these things, and I can simply just call this weapon. All right. I can get rid of this Boolean, because a Boolean in a constructor is bad juju. Anytime you go into a code review and you have a constructor with a Boolean in it, expect to get sent back to your desk to rewrite it, because these are not intuitive and understandable. And when you pass a Boolean into a class in a constructor, you have absolutely no idea what the behavior is going to be when you do that. Bad idea. Anyway, so what we're going to do in here instead is we're going to use a pattern called Dependency Injection. This samurai depends on a weapon in order to be a samurai. So we're going to hand him the weapon that he's going to use when we want him to use it. So we'll pass this in the constructor, and in here we simply set this value. Great. And finally, when we need to attack, we can get rid of all this if stuff, which is super awesome. And we just say weapon.hit target. Look at all that code that we lost. Now you might be saying, I don't know the weapon. I mean, what if we just tell him to attack? What if it's he's in a situation where we don't have time to tell him, or it's dark and we don't know the foe? He should default to a particular weapon, and we can sure do that. We can set it up so that the default constructor, the weapon that is created, equals a new sword. Whoops. Okay, well this is all good. So now what I need to come back in here and do is, instead of passing in false, I can say here's my new samurai with a brand new sword. That's good stuff, and when I attack, he should chop everybody in half, and he does. That's good. Now if I take this out, he should still chop everybody in half, and he sure does. Okay, we're off and running. But as I was writing this stuff, you probably sat here and looked back at my samurai and said, I don't know, man, 2 constructors, and I'm not quite sure what you bought with this dependency injection pattern. Well, I actually bought a whole lot. I bought the ability to make my application extremely flexible in the future, where I could use any weapon, really. But what if I wanted to use the samurai in other situations? What if I didn't really want to, have the implementation dictated way down deep in code? What if I didn't want the samurai to know anything about the sword class? Well, that is where inversion of control comes in, and that's what we're going to tackle right now. So let's diverge now off to inversion of control. How do we implement inversion of control here, and why would we do it? All right, well, first let's talk about the word inversion of control. What does that mean? Well, first and foremost, this class right here, the samurai class, it controls, in this line, it controls the instantiation of this dependency. And that is what typical control is. If you have a class that needs another class, usually you'll have a reference in there to it of some kind, and then it'll instantiate it, configure it, use it, and then it's done. If you think about that, if you think about the usage of all your objects throughout your application being instantiated in all the other objects that they need, we have control of that object everywhere. If you invert that control and put instantiation in a central location with rules around it, with lifetime settings around it, that is inverting that control. And then you set things up so that things get injected as required. So that's what I want to do with my samurai class. Now, if you don't quite follow what it is I'm talking about, let's just keep rolling here, and hopefully you can tell by the time I get to the end of the screencast. First thing I want to do is I want to set this up with the inject attribute. This is from Ninject, and this is going to set my samurai's constructor up to be injected. Now, I'm not going to do this injection. The container is going to do it for me. The container you can think of as, well, like a dating system, matchmaker. You ask it for an object, it will go and find all of the dependent objects based on its constructor and inject it as required, which is pretty handy. So I can take that out now, and now I have a nice loose coupling here with my samurai. All he needs is an eye weapon, and he's happy. So I've lowered his exposure, I've lowered his requirements to a simple eye weapon. He doesn't know anything about a sword, he doesn't know anything about a katana, nothing about a shuriken. Any kind of weapon could come to him and he'll attack with it. That is a powerful samurai. Okay, so now what I need to do is I need to wire up Ninject. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create another class, and I will call this a warrior module. There we go, and I will have it implement the Ninject module. And let's do control period. And in here, I'm going to simply override load. Okay, what did I just do? A Ninject module is a special place where you tell it, hey, when you see these interfaces, I want you to hand me back an object, okay? And you can use this lifetime for it. So in this case, what I want is to set two rules. I want to be able to set the warrior, and I want to be able to set the weapon. And I can do that using bind. So I say bind, and every time you see iWarrior, I want you to give me a samurai. It's easy as that. Okay, well the samurai needs a weapon, so every time you see a weapon, I want you to give me a sword. And that's all we need to do to have those as rules for our warrior and his weapon. We can change these as we need to, but for right now we're going to leave that as it is. Alright, well to use this thing, I can take this out of here. To use this thing, what I'm going to do, I'm going to just comment this out right now, is I need to create what's called the kernel. Now, what we're dealing with here when we deal with Ninject is a thing called a container, an object container. What it's doing when the application starts, when it sees this module and it loads this module up, it's actually creating a whole host of objects inside of there, and it's kind of keeping those objects in memory, doling them out and injecting things as needed. It's knitting things together. It's playing matchmaker. So to get at my objects now, I need to create what's called the kernel, and I can do that. I can just say var kernel, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a brand new kernel, and I believe it is simply called a standard kernel. And when I do that, I need to pass it a module. In other words, it needs to know the rules by which it's going to instantiate things. So in this case, I'll pass it in a brand new warrior module. That's it. So now what I can do is I can go get Sam here, my samurai, and I can say kernel.get me iWarrior, please. And that's it. And now I can come back in here and say sam.attack. So that's pretty easy. Not so bad. So if I run this, there it is. So that's all done for me. Now the neat thing about this is I've lightened up the code a lot in here, made it very testable. I've come back down here to shuriken and sword. They do what they need to do only. This is nice, clean, really good separation. Okay, well, you can probably tell that I can do a lot with these modules. I just called this warrior module. I might even just call this sword module. There we go. Call this a sword module. I might have another one called ranged, for lack of better words. Why not? And in the ranged module, I have the warrior, and I have him using his shuriken. Or excuse me, I have the samurai, I have him using the shuriken, and instead here what I can do is instantiate up the ranged module, and in this case he's going to use the shuriken. Pierce the unwashed masses armor. Alright. So a couple other things I can do in here is when I talk about instantiating the warrior, I can also pass in other things. So I could say something like, let's use a certain scope. I might say something like, as a singleton. There it is. Now my warrior is a singleton, and it will stay in memory throughout the lifetime of my application. I wouldn't have had to, in order to make a singleton otherwise, I would have had to do a lot of different coding to get around it, so you can control the lifetime in this way. Now, there's other things you can do in here aside from keeping things as singletons, of course. You can manage other lifetime situations. You can use transient scope, which basically means as required. You can use thread scope, which means if there's a new thread that opens up, we'll open up a different object for it. Singleton, we already discussed. We can do in request scope, which is great for web applications because it keeps the application alive for a single request. That's good for something like data context and link to SQL, or session if you use Hibernate, or an ADO connection if you use just straight up ADO. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this screencast. First in our concepts series on dependency injection and inversion of control. Clearly there is a lot more that I can show about these, and indeed I do in some of our premium screencasts using inversion of control in Kona, which is the web application, e-commerce application I'll be building out with Allende as we implement and hibernate into Kona. I'll also be using inversion of control in my blog application, and you can see how I use it in depth in that application as well. Well, thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions, you can send me an email to follow, or you can leave a comment down below. Thank you very much.